Hello, everybody. Hey, my name is Rachel Hedman. You're probably like, this is not your home. No, this is the Russell home. We are so grateful to them. And first off, I just want to have a round of applause to any hosts, including the Russells today. So let's do that. And if you're wondering who I am, why is this Rachel Hedman up here? I'm the founding executive director of Story Crossroads. This is our 78th house concert. I mean, that is crazy. I mean, it really is crazy. And that means we'll have a 79th and an 80th, but right now we're in the moment. We are here at the 78. And for those of you online, hey, I see you, yeah. And we'll make sure that we acknowledge you and look at you, don't worry. We are excited for you to be here. Some of you are doing virtual live, which is great. And some of you are gonna be more after the fact, but we love you no matter what. But you have a job to do. Emojis or applaud, even if we don't hear it or it's after the fact, just, do the normal stuff. And then all of you, you know how it works, right? In person, this is the best, we have to admit, is the best here. I mean, yeah. And a few things about Story Crossroads, if you've never heard of it before. We are a nonprofit that promotes arts education of oral storytelling. But sometimes in order to celebrate the art, it's not just about teaching the art, it's about actually having festivals and house concerts because, that way there's a stage for people to show their art, whether they are community tellers like youth or older tellers, or if they're professionals like what we have tonight. And so we appreciate through the years, because we're going to be going on our 9th Summit and Festival, which you'll definitely want to check out later. So you can just go to storycrossroads.org/festival if you want to check it out. And we have funding every year through Utah Humanities. We have funding every year through the Western States Arts Federation. So it's WestStaff. So I have to think, what does that mean, WestStaff? And then we also get funding every year from the Utah Division of Arts and Museums. We're very grateful to them. And we also get a lot of funding with the Salt Lake City Arts Council. We get funding from just a lot of places. And we also get that from you. Now we have house concerts so people can come whether or not they donate, but it's very easy to. And even those online, you can just go to storycrossroads.org/donate. Many different options. And that way it not only helps Story Crossroads, but it helps our storyteller. And I know you'll be impressed and be like, yes, please. So here's the thing. This is a remarkable woman. And she does all kinds of stories, but tonight we're gonna have all kinds of these inspiring stories, people who feel like everyday people, but maybe not. And so we are going to go into that bravery, boldness, and backbone. And she's been doing this a long time. She teaches others. So let us welcome to the stage, Cassie Ashton.
I think some of my favorite concerts are just house concerts. We get to have this kind of cozy, intimate group. And I'm really grateful that you guys are here because it's hard to tell stories without an audience. Sometimes we do it on screen, but we definitely prefer to do it in person. Now, like Rachel said, I will be sharing some kind of stories of, people that have come before. And maybe you guys have ever played one of those games like the Get to Know You games or the conversation cards. And one of them always is, who's a hero or a fascinating person or somebody you look up to? Now, for me, who I find fascinating is just the everyday person who had no intention really of doing, becoming, having any notoriety or becoming famous or anything like that. But because they believed in something, because they stood up for something, because they cared about something, they became memorable. And so I'll share a few of those stories with you tonight. Now, let's start with our defiant, determined Scottish dame. She lived during the 14th century. And oh boy, she kind of lived during the second in Scottish independence. And she would take a stand kind of to protect her castle. Black Agnes. looked down at the army below her. And instead of being terrified, she just hollered at them and said, "We will keep our castle. We will keep our castle. The one stands upon another. Though that old English Edward himself were to come to the castle gate, now we will keep it." Now, Agnes Randolph came from some sturdy stock, and she was quite a tenacious woman. Now, her father was Thomas Randolph, who happened to be the second in command of Robert the Bruce, who helped free Scotland the first time round. And her husband was Patrick, the 9th Earl of Dunbar and March. And so that made her a countess. But she was beloved by her people. And it was those people that gave her, I guess you could say, the nickname of Black Agnes. Not because of the color of her skin, but because of the color of her long black hair that they said was as dark as night. The brows that kind of shaped her big eyes that too were as black as obsidian. And so she was known as Black Agnes. Now, she lived in Castle Dunbar, which happened to be right there in kind of on the North Berkshire coast, if you know much of England. It's kind of by the North Sea, but it's kind of on the border between Scotland and England. And it was a fortress castle built right there into the rock. You could hear the waves crashing down at the sea below. And well, they had enjoyed 4 years of peace, but now the English had decided they wanted Scotland back. And so they'd come attacking again. And her husband was out with many of the other lords, protecting all the skirmishes that were going round and about. And this meant that on the other side of the border, William Montagu, who was the Earl of Salisbury there, thought, that castle will be vulnerable. It was strategically placed, and if he could take it over, that would be quite the coup. He was a favorite of English Edward, and he'd given him permission to go on in. And he thought, it's only a mere lady who holds the castle. So he took his large army, he crossed the border, and he began to camp out in front of the castle. Now, he had underestimated that mere woman, for she tended to be just as stubborn as he was. But she was fearless. For most of us, if we would have seen that army, we might have been filled with fear. Not nothing. Nah, she just looked at them. Now, she knew her castle was pretty strong and pretty protected. But she just kind of had this, sassy way about her. And I like to make the Earl know that. And she would holler at him, well, Earl, catch me if you can. Now, of course, then everybody on the top would laugh. I know, I am a woman in a woman's frail body, but I think I have the spirit of a man, a soldier. So do what you can. And they would laugh. And well, he had his war machines, and sure enough, one of those big rocks would come booming onto him, and they would try to get close, but the arrows would stop them quickly. And the men that were left there were doing a pretty good job of protecting. But the castle would shake from all of the arrows that would come through. One day, she decided probably just to needle William Montagu, that she went and got a little white cloth, and she gave them to all of her beautiful ladies. And she said, we're going to go up top, and we're going to do some cleaning. Why, those big rocks, they've been causing a little bit of dust on her castle. And sure enough, they all went up in there in their finery, and they had their little cloths, and they leaned across the castle. They began wiping away all of the dust. Well, you could just kind of see, now don't you worry, Don't you worry, oh Montague. It looks like you're having so much fun, such sport, and dropping those. It's fine. We'll just wipe away the dust. Not a problem. Now, this did kind of really irritate him. He thought to himself, somebody's got to teach that lady some manners. Now, whether he was going to be able to do that or not is a whole nother, we'll wait to be seen. Now, these sieges sometimes take a while. One day, she was kind of there in the courtyard and she heard a strange noise. And she peeked in one of the windows and quickly knew she needed to run up top. Now, she was surprised to see that they were rolling some contraption that they had made. It was on wheels, but it was some kind of platform. Well, she said it kind of looked like a hog or a really sad pig, Now, she was wise enough to know that inside that contraption were men, and they never could quite get close enough to the castle, for the archer's aim was good and true, and they had kept him at bay, and they figured that if they could get that contraption close enough, then the men could escape the arrows and they could get out. Well, Montague was down there and he was gloating. He was so proud of himself. And well, Agnes, she just called the men together, for they had collected quite a few, treasures that he had sent them, big rocks, maybe more like boulders. And so it would take a couple of the men, but she said, let's just wait, just get ready. And they all kind of got their rocks and they let them come closer and closer and closer till they were certain, they were in good. And then they lifted, and as soon as she said, go, 1, 2, 3, and you could hear this swoosh of rocks and then this crash upon the wood as you heard the wood splintering and the screams of the men, and as they began to come out startled and a little bit bruised and then running. And of course, you heard the men on top. Look at the wee little piggies, the little English piggies. Well, Montague was getting more and more frustrated. He figured that if brute force wasn't going to be enough, then he would have to try another tactic. A tactic that the English were quite used to doing was just bribe someone to betray their person, Again, they didn't really quite understand how devoted her people were to her. One night when she was kind of, as I read, going around doing her rounds, kind of like maybe at night when we go through and we lock our doors and make sure everything's set before you go to bed. She was doing that. And a warder who was off duty at the time brought her off to the side and said that, he had been approached and they would be given, a nice bribe if he would just leave the gate open. She listened. Accept the bribe. Go ahead, do it. Do what they ask, and I'll take care of the rest. Of course, he wouldn't have ever done it without her permission, but now they were warned. And sure enough, on that specific time and day, the gates had been raised. It was late at night, midnight, and Montague was he had a group with him. They just figured if they could get inside, that would be enough, and then they could conquer. And they were going through, and he had a young squire with him, John Copeland, and he was just about ready to cross the threshold when John kind of scooted in front of him, tripped the wire, down came the gate. He jumped into the back, and you could hear him kind of recognizing what happened. And John is inside now, a prisoner. And sure enough, that annoying but familiar voice came behind the little wall. Oh, Montague, you're so slow. Don, you could have joined us for dinner and we could have settled this easily this night. But alas, maybe later. Now he was wondering what was going to happen. And then he got some good news. She had a brother who was the Earl of Moray. And in all of the skirmishes, he found out that he had been captured and now was a prisoner of the English. And so he'd gotten permission to have this brother transferred to him. And he thought, well, I will threaten her. And so he tied a noose around the brother's neck and he began to parade him down to the bottom and say, surrender or your brother will die. Now, she didn't really care for his she felt that this wasn't done in honor. Tis my brother, but he has no children. So if he dies, I inherit the castle of Moray. And I think another castle for me to protect is a good thing, don't you? Well, luckily she had called their bluff because they took the noose off and went back to camp to once again lick their wounds. Now, if nothing else was gonna, if bargaining and arguing and tricking wasn't gonna work, he would starve her out. Now, she did have a good supply, or maybe not good enough, not long enough, because the days turned into weeks and the weeks turned into months. And sure enough, the rations got smaller and smaller. But even through it all, she kind of still had this energy, this optimism, this enthusiasm. Everybody loved her. And none of them were willing. If she didn't want to give up, they wouldn't give up either. But it was getting dire. Then, one spring morning, Montague was thinking, oh, please, something needs to break. And he sees a messenger come running. And he thought, oh, good news. I have a message. She has decided to surrender. No, sir. Don't know how. But Sir Alexander Ramsay, why, the sly dog, somehow he skipped, he got through our blockade. And why, he's brought supplies, he's brought food and men. And, well, if you're willing to wait another 5 months, then you might be able to win. Now, starting one out was a risky game, but waiting on the will of Agnes, that wasn't a sure bet. And so finally, he decided it was time after, 5 months that he would head home. And when she saw all of the tents go down, and then she saw them getting onto their ship, why, she ended up grabbing her white cloth, and she just kind of waved to him. And he just picked up a sword and just kind of bowed to her, thinking to himself that, well, the Earl of Dunbar still had his castle, thanks to Agnes. Well, from that day on, Agnes became this hero in Scottish folklore. Right away, there was a great ballad that was written about her, and one of my favorite lines was, she makes a terror of tower and trench, that boisterous body Scottish wench. Come I early, come I late, I find Agnes at the gate. I'm not sure that I would be willing to, that I would have that much tenacity and that much bravery, but boy, I sure would like to think that I could have that. She just seems to be one of those fun characters to me. Now, it is interesting, though. There are many people that will go through some extreme measures to fight for their freedom. And our next storyteller had done the same thing, not only for his own freedom, but for others. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. Now, you might be familiar with that song. That song's been sung for a long time, primarily by the slaves. It was one of their spirituals that kept them going. And this is a story of a boy who was born a slave, who fought for his own freedom and then helped America find her freedom as well. It's a story of Crispus Attucks. And I'd like to introduce him the way Martin Luther King Jr. did. But so that I don't mess up his words, let me just use this. Crispus Attucks is one of the most important figures in African American history. Not for what he did for his own people, but what he did for all oppressed people everywhere. He is a reminder that African American heritage is not only African, but American, and it is the beginning of America. Now, if you don't know who he is, I'll let you know, because I thought to myself, I should have known, but I didn't. So when I find people, I go, oh, that's really cool. Let's start at his beginning. His beginning came with his father, Prince Younger, who was taken from Africa and brought over onto the slave ship, sold in the slave market in Boston, Massachusetts, bought by a Colonel Buckminster and taken to a farm to Framingham, Massachusetts, about 23 miles from Boston. Now, he worked there on the farm quite some time, but eventually did fall in love with a beautiful girl, Nanny Addicks. Now, Nanny Addicks was a Indian. Now, many of the Indians were also forced into slavery, American Indians. And she was from the Wampanoag tribe. Hopefully I said that right. But like all kind of powerless people, the two found each other. They fell in love. There were many African and Native American marriages. They had 3 children, one of them being Christmas. Now, luckily, Colonel Buckminster seems to have been well, if you can have good slave owners, it seemed to be peaceful. They stayed together for a long time. But when he was 16, he was sold to a Deacon William Brown, also there in Framingham. And in his service, somehow he became like working with cattle and helping with all that. Now, how he escapes, we don't know. But when he's 27, we know he escaped because of an ad in the newspaper. And so let me share it. You can actually go and find it still. But here, we'll show them that there's the ad in the newspaper, but I'm going to share it with you. It says, run away from Master William Brown of Framingham on the 30th of September last. A mulatto fellow. Now, if you don't know what mulatto is, that means that they have mixed blood because he was both African and American Indian. About 27 years of age, 6 foot 2 inches, named Crispus. He had on his knees, oh, I love this. His knees are nearer together than common, and a light colored buckskin coat, plain festoon jacket, brown wool buckskin, new buckskin breeches, blue yarn stockings, and a checked woolen shirt. Whoever shall take up and bring said runaway, he'll give him a great reward of 10 pounds, which would have been over $500 or so to us there. And then all your charges would be paid. And then he warns them that any masters of the vessels or others that hereby caution against concealing or carrying off this said servant under penalty of law. And that was posted in October 2nd of 1750. Now another, in about November, middle of November, another ad went out. The end of November, another ad went out. But he never was apprehended. For he had been wise enough to, well, first take on a alias. He became Michael Johnson, and he joined one of the few things that many of the colored people could do, and that was sailing. And he joined a whaling ship. Now, he was suited for the whaling ship because he was, like you said, 6'2", and he was big. I mean, we probably would have called him a linebacker today. And he was big. And it was required because if you wanted to go whaling, you had to be strong. Partly what they would do is once they would get out onto the ocean, they'd be on a big boat. They would get into a smaller boat and they would go out, and then they would try to harpoon the whale. And then they would have to row it all the way back. And you needed some strength. So he spent quite a few years on the whaling ship. Now, when they weren't whaling and he would go into the dock, he did learn how to become a rope maker. Later, we found records that at some point he switched from becoming a whaler to merchant sailor, where he's on one of the merchant sailors. Those are the ones that are going through and, selling all of the goods, the teas and the cottons, and going down to the West Indies and everywhere. Now, this was specifically kind of during the French and Indian War. Now, if you're not great on your history, The French and Indian War was fought to see who was going to be charged of America, the French or the English. Well, the English won. And I guess we should be happy. Now, while they were fighting, I think the colonists were happy. But when the French left, the colonists weren't so happy because the English decided that, well, they were now quite a bit of debt and that the colonists should help pay for that debt. And that's when you start hearing the rumblings of taxation without representation, because they didn't have a seat in Parliament. They didn't have any say-so in what was going on. And they preferred being colonists. They liked not having any oversight. But now they were having oversight. And they'd hoped that the troops would go back, but they hadn't. And then there came this other kind of quartering act, where it was declared that the colonists needed to feed and house and help out the soldiers. Well, they didn't have anything to do with that. They didn't want to have the soldiers. They said, we can defend ourselves, send your soldiers home. And then it got even worse. I mean, we're just telling you that the powder keg is growing, right? Because now the soldiers who aren't very well paid on their off time are looking for jobs, competing with all of the other workers. And so now the dock workers and all that, they're not really happy about the soldiers. Well, all of this kind of starts to come to a head on March 2nd in one of the taverns. There is the redcoats have come in, a whole bunch of the dock workers, the rope workers are in there. One of the sailors is looking for a job. The others are like, you don't deserve a job. There's a huge brawl. And that whole weekend, there seemed to be in the alleyways and wherever you could see just kind of all of these little skirmishes everywhere. Come Monday, March 5th, well, they didn't need much to light that fuse. But Edward Garlick, a young kid. Now, again, many of them didn't like it. And the British soldiers were posted out by the State House and they were kind of obnoxious, but he was a young kid and he just kind of did what some of the others did. And he slung names at him. He probably shouldn't have, but things like lobster tails, bloody red coats, bloody backs, because they had these red coats. Well, I think one of the soldiers was probably just as frustrated. He picks up the butt of his gun and he hits Edward in the head. And he really bloodies his ear pretty bad. And the boy goes running. Now he's upset. While he's running, it's later at night, he runs into a group of men, Crispus being in the front, these dock workers and stuff, and they see him all bloody. They're like, Edward, what's going on? And he explains to them what happened. That was it. So you could see them. They all went around and they looked for whatever kind of sticks. They didn't have weapons, but they looked for sticks and anything. And they said, no. Now this group of about 8 men didn't take long before it became 20, 15, 20, up to about 30 men that began storming up to the State House. And there was a handful of soldiers, but not many. But when they saw this mob, they started getting a little bit nervous, and they're yelling at them, telling them not to hurt their boys. And well, they started seeing everybody being so agitated. It probably wasn't really smart on their part. But a couple of them had little bayonets on their rifles and decided to poke them, like to push them back, to say, don't come any closer, don't come any closer. But that just infuriated him. One of the soldiers even looked at Crispus and said, what are you doing here? This is the white man's problem. Crispus grabbed his bayonet, ripping his gun, and said, no, this is my home too. Because he didn't like any of this happening in his home. Well, the church bells rang, which was kind of a call that would have gone out whenever there was an emergency like a fire. Who said it? Nobody really knows. But somebody screamed, fire. And the soldiers took that to mean they had permission to fire. And so they lifted their rifles, they pulled their triggers, And sure enough, the gunpowder and the bullets went flying. One of them hit Crispus, rocked him back, and a second took him down to the ground. Well, he wasn't the only one to fall to the ground. In all the chaos and the pandemonium, it was quick to see that there was about 4 or 5 on the frozen ground, for it was cold, snowy March day, dead or dying. Well, as everybody went running everywhere, some of the dock workers picked up those who had been injured and or now dead. They weren't quite sure, but took them off. 3 of them were taken to the homes that they lived there. But Crispus and James Caldwell didn't have family. So they were taken to Faneuil Hall, where they were laid out so that all of the city could come and mourn them. Well, this would quickly become known as the Boston Massacre. And Boston residents weren't having any of it. And so it was that they said no. Now there would be a great funeral procession where about 10,000 would kind of line up 6 deep. And there's only about 16,000 in the whole city, but they were, the procession went. The 5 that had died was Samuel Gray. He was a tailor. Let me see if I've got that right. And then Samuel Maverick, an ivory worker, an instrument maker and ivory tuner. James Caldwell, a mariner. Crispus Attucks, the first man to die the first African-American man to die in the Revolution, but not the first African-American to die to be free, or his desire to be free. Well, they all buried them in a communal grave. A beautiful monument was placed for them. Sometime later, after they did have an investigation, but John Adams would write, and again, I'm not going to quote of that. He writes, it was that night that the formation of American independence was laid. Not the Battle of Lexington or the Battle of Bunker Hill, not the surrender of Burgoyne or the Cornwallis, but the battle on King Street on March 5th, 1770. From that moment, we date our severance of the British Empire. And so I think you can better understand now that quote from Martin Luther King when he said, Crispus Attucks is one of the most important figures in African-American history, not for what he did for his own race, but what he did for all oppressed people everywhere. He is a reminder that the African-American heritage is not only African, but American, and it begins with the beginning of America. And personally, I'm so glad for those that helped create a country where I can be free. Now, we do live in a country that's free, and I am grateful for that. But there are some freedoms that have been a little bit harder to win. And one of those is religious freedom. For those of us that live here in the Utah, might appreciate this story. But I'm going to go ahead. It's the story of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and how they had to work hard to find a place to be free. But I'd like to tell it in the words of Celia Mounts Hunt. I've been asked to tell you a little about our experience in walking with the Mormon Battalion. But please let me introduce myself. I'm Celia Mounts Hunt. I'm the wife of Jefferson Hunt, the commander of Company A. Now, but let me give you a little bit of background if you're not aware. Now, you see, I met Jefferson when I was a young girl at a Christian revival. And oh my goodness, when I saw him, he was, like they said, tall. He was dark and handsome. Now, he says that when he saw me, why, I just took his breath away. I guess you could say it was love at first sight. And it did not take long for us to get married, settle, create a home. We were living there in Albion, Illinois for a while. And well, then I happened to hear about a preacher, Levi Hancock, who was, why, he was mighty in his speaking, and I liked what he had to say. And so I listened more, and I find out about this new kind of religious organization, and well, I liked it. Well, Jefferson didn't want to have anything to do with it, but as I joined and as he realized how serious I really was, he did say that, well, a family that prays together will stay together. And so he did decide to go ahead and join. And well, I'm ever so grateful. And as soon as he did, he has always, looked out for the welfare of our community. Now, we ended up leaving and going to far west Missouri to be with our people. I had no idea that there were so many people against our desire to worship. Now, all we wanted to do was to have a home, to live peaceful, to raise our children in the beliefs that we believed in. But we would be chased from home after home after home. We'd hoped when we got to Nauvoo that we had finally found a place. But that was short-lived. And I remember when Joseph Smith was martyred, and then when Brigham Young came to Jefferson. Now, Jefferson had already proven to himself to they call him sometimes Captain Jefferson, but to be a good man of leadership. And he asked him, he said, if we are to survive, there isn't anywhere around here for us to have a home. We are going to have to go where there are no people. We're going to have to go west. Where west, he didn't know, but we'd have to go west. And he asked if Jefferson wouldn't be a captain of 100, and he was getting them together. And so in February, 1846 or so, we ended up crossing the frozen Missouri River over into Iowa. Now, we were pretty well prepared, but many weren't, and it took a while. In the next couple of months, more and more of our brothers and sisters would come over into Iowa, and there were settlements all over, somewhere between 10,000 or more, slowly would kind of pop up. But now our problem is how are we going to be able to fund this exodus? Now, Brigham Young had sent word to President Polk. He had suggested or offered, you know what? There were many people were thinking about going west, and we could set up, the government could pay us to set up little guideposts or things like that, on our thing. President Polk made a counteroffer. Well, they were just about to start a Mexican-American war, and he would pay us to have our men join the army. What was he thinking? Why would we join an army, well, the American army, when they wouldn't do anything to protect us? Why would we protect them? This was not going to fly. No, I saw the posters, and I didn't like the idea. But then Brigham came. He came to Jefferson, but first he also came to me. And he said that, yeah, he didn't like the idea anymore, but it would fund the exodus. That there were so many that didn't have the money, and if the soldiers went, it would help. And he knew that it would be a hardship on me, with my husband, my protector and provider, to leave for a year and to march across the plains, but would I support him? I wished he wouldn't ask, but I had promised that I would support the prophet, and when he asks, I said I would. And so Jefferson became the captain of Company A and the captain of the rest of the kind of over all of the 500 which meant they had to get their own group. Well, my son Gilbert, who was 21, joined up, and of course my son Marshall, he also joined up. Now, at that time, there was the army would allow laundresses to go and with them. Now, for some of the young men who had maybe no children or one child, they could go, their wives could go and be laundresses. If I had 7 minor children still, I wasn't gonna be nobody's laundress. I had my own laundry to do. Now, luckily, you know, we were had enough, and Jefferson left me. Milton Kelly, his nephew, was going to be with us. He would help us get out west when Brigham Young decided to go, or I would wait there until he got back. And that's what many of the women, they had to decide, were they going to be brave themselves? Some did. Were they going to wait? And some of them went with their husbands as laundresses. Well, July 25th, Captain Pitt's brass band, well, it played and we danced, and it was our farewell dance. My husband, Captain Edward, they were the first group to leave, and then some of the others. Now, I was so surprised a week later when all of a sudden I saw Captain Higgins and a few of the other men come back into everything, and he brought me a letter. And Jefferson had written me a letter explaining that Colonel Allen, now he was the government representative, asked where the family was. And I said, well, they're out in Council Bluffs. Well, why not? Why didn't they come? If you got wagons, if you got provisions, they can come. And so Jefferson was asking if I'd like to go with him on the trip with the Mormon Battalion. Well, I thought about that. I had to counsel with Sarah Higgins, for she also had a large family. Her husband was also a captain. We looked out at the sea, covered wagons and some of the dugouts. We figured, well, eventually we got to make that trek into unknown territory. So might as well do it with our husbands. And so I now became a woman who marched, not a woman who waited. And off I went to Fort Leavenworth. Well, we got to Fort Leavenworth, and well, we got there. They were giving the soldiers money for uniforms. They didn't really buy a lot of uniforms. The only thing that they all had in common was a white belt. They all kept their white belts, and the rest of $42 went back to the home to help the exodus. We took off onto the march. It was kind of exciting in the beginning. It didn't take long before we realized it wasn't quite so fun and exciting, though we were going to have to overcome some obstacles. Now, I remember a couple of weeks in when all of a sudden, it was a Wednesday, and we had just kind of set up camp and everybody was straggling in. And when all of a sudden I was a little bit ill, I was in the wagon by myself, and Jefferson, being the good husband he is, he had the little twins. Now, I had 2 twins, they were barely a year old, and he had them in the tent, and he was trying to give me some time to rest. When all of a sudden I heard such a commotion. Wow, there was rain and there was wind, and it never had experienced anything like it. And I looked out, and it was just chaos. Why wagons were being pushed around everywhere, and it was whirling. It lasted about 20 to 30 minutes. When it was all settled down and calm, there was only 5/10 of the 100 that stood standing. Now, I had looked out and I had seen poor Jefferson doing everything he could to keep the tent from completely collapsing on him and the little ones. Luckily, nobody drowned, and we were fine. Now, we were wet. No one was drying out that night. We were wet. I was worried that some of us would get sicker because of it. But we didn't. Somehow we were blessed. But then came more marching. And more marching, and every day marching. And it was hard keeping pace with the soldiers. The little ones were struggling a little bit, and it was rough. Then about, I don't know, sometime into mid-September, we switched. Well, the commanders, that is, Colonel Allen had gotten ill and he had passed away, and now Lieutenant Smith was in charge. He didn't really like all the families. He didn't like the family wagons. He didn't like us being there, and he let us know. And he didn't like the fact that some of the sick men would get into the wagons of the others. And you see, he got mad because technically they were supposed to go to Dr. Sanderson and get medicine. Well, Dr. Sanderson, he would give them calomel, which was mercury chloride. It was archaic medicine. Brigham Young had already told the soldiers, don't take it. And he had just one old rusty spoon he'd beat it with him. And so we weren't doing that. One day, a couple of the boys were in Thomas and Albina's wagon. Now, she was kind of like a healer herself. She knew all about herbs and things like that. And she was taking care of the boys that were struggling. And all of a sudden, Dr. Sanderson and Lieutenant Smith came up and, what are these boys doing? And had they gone to the doctor? Yes, they went to the LBS doctor, Dr. McIntyre. No, they had to go to Dr. Sanderson and have medicine. And they're just screaming at him. The boys are like, we will let our bones get bleached in the desert before we're taking any of that medicine. Well, that really riled him up. And all of a sudden, Lieutenant was looking at Sergeant Williams, whose wagon it was, and he pulled out his saber and he began to threaten him. Sergeant Williams didn't take kindly. He picked up his whip and he said, you make a move and I will whip you to shreds. We all stood there and just watched for a second. Luckily, Lieutenant Smith, he put his sword back in his thing and he just asked the sergeant his name. Well, let me tell you, it was exciting like that quite often. Luckily, it was shortly after that we ran into a John Brown. Now, John Brown happened to be from our faith, and he was the leader of the Missouri Saints. The Missouri Saints happened to be a group, and they had decided that they would meet up with Brigham Young en route. Well, they had left Missouri, but Brigham Young hadn't left yet, and so now they didn't know where they were supposed to go. So they had kind of made a home in Colorado in a place called Fort Pueblo. It was kind of a mountain men winter rendezvous type area. Well, soon as Lieutenant Smith heard there was a place he could ship some of us, he decided that was a good idea. And in truth, some of us felt like it wasn't a bad idea either. And so there was a group of the 9 largest families, well, myself and Sarah Higgins's, and were rerouted to go to Pueblo. I was sad not to keep with my husband and whatnot, but luckily my son Gilbert acted as one of the escorts to Pueblo. We got to Pueblo and it was a good idea. The kids were having a hard time keeping up, and we built some little shelters and built a hall and planted some corn, and at least we would winter there and it would be better for us. About a month later, another detachment, the Brown detachment, showed up. The rest of the women and children and all of the sick men. Well, most of the women and children, there were 5 women that would make it all the way to California. But their stories are more than I can tell you this night. In that Brown detachment, I came upon Joseph Richards. He's a young 17-year-old boy, and I knew his mom real well, and he was so sick. And I knew I had to do everything I could to nurse that boy back to health. His mother had already sacrificed so much. Her oldest boy, well, he'd been killed in Missouri and was down at the bottom of a well. Her 2 other boys were off preaching the gospel. Her youngest was too young to be on the march, but she had given her 17-year-old Joseph for the cause, and he had been marching. I did all that I could. But he just wasn't strong enough to survive. We buried him. A month later, I would bury my twin boy, barely a year old, Parham. It wasn't all bad, though. Though we had some sorrows, even though Brigham had promised no one would die in battle, he couldn't promise no one would die from ailments or sickness, because that was just life in those days. There were good celebrations that we had births, we had weddings. My son Gilbert, he fell in love with one of the Missouri Saints girls, a beautiful Lydia. So we had some weddings, and we were thrilled in May when we got word that we could pack up, and if possible, we would be able to meet with a Brigham Young, for we were going to try to meet up with him. We almost did. He crossed into a new area that he would call the Valley. And 5 days later, our whole 29 wagons of families also crossed over into the new place we would call home for a long time. Lived in one of the first adobe houses. Eventually, Jefferson would join us. Oh, we would have more adventures after that as well. But I can just say I was so grateful to finally have found a place where we could be at home, safe and sound, and raise our children in our faith. Well, last story for the night is one also kind of great faith. It's a story of a man who became just an ordinary man, who became a daimyojin. In Japanese, that means, well, kind of deity. See, in 1854, in the land of the rising sun, there was a great man, Hamaguchi Goryo. Now, he was just an ordinary headman. He was the wealthiest, most influential man in his village. But he had because of his title, he could have been called Shoja. Well, most people just call him Ojiya-san, which means grandfather. Or you see, that's how he treated everybody, as if they were his grandchildren. Any of the young farmers that had questions, he would help them. If they needed to arbitrate, he would do that. If somebody needed a little extra money, he was usually there to give it to them. And he always made sure they got the best price for their rice. Now, he was beloved by all. Now, it just so happened, though, that he was getting older on in years. Now, he lived in a great big farmhouse up kind of on a plateau. And down from the plateau, it was kind of terraced. You could kind of see a zigzag, and much of his rice was planted there. And on other sides, there was forest. And it kind of opened up into just imagine the farmhouse is here, and then it opened up into the bay of the ocean. And then dotted there was about 90 to 100 little houses where everybody lived. There was a small little temple, and then the huge Buddhist temple was up on the hill as well. Well, it was harvest time. They had a great harvest. Soon they would be taking all the rice to market. And so they were having a celebration, a festival. Now, if you've ever been to Japan, and I have, they love their festivals. They really get into them, and they enjoy them. And everybody was going to head down to their festivals. But, well, that day, it had been a super hot day. And he was worn out. And so he told the rest of the family to go, and he would stay. They left Tara, his 10-year-old grandson, well, just to look after him. Middle of the night, he just was having a hard time. He'd gone out, kind of on the veranda or whatever. He looked down, and he could see, well, the brightly lit lanterns, and he could hear the beating of the big drums, and the laughter of the children and the dances. And well, it just brought such joy to him. But he did kind of think that this kind of oppressive, yucky heat, it wasn't uncommon when that happened for there to be, well, shakes, earthquakes. It wasn't long before he felt one of those kind of small little moves. Now, the townspeople, they didn't notice it at all because they were in their festivities, dancing and singing and doing all that. So they didn't, but he noticed. He wasn't worried. Until standing out, something caught his eye. He wasn't quite sure. Out on the horizon, out in the ocean, something didn't quite look right. Kind of noticed that it's like the ocean was moving away from him. He started to think of a conversation his father and his grandfather had. Now, the townsfolk also had kind of seen noticed something weird was kind of going on. And it wasn't long before a few of the people were like, oh, look what's happening. They didn't think much of it. They could just see something weird was going on with the ocean and with all of that. But it wasn't long before they were back to their festivities. But Hamaguchi, he had never seen it. He didn't know, but he could remember that conversation. And he feared for what it might mean. He knew in his heart somehow that those 400 people were in danger. But what was he to do? Well, he couldn't get up to the temple fast enough. Well, how would he alert them? Now, there's something you need to know. In Japan, they kind of have a community obligation. It's understood by all that if the call goes out, if somebody's in distress, if there is a problem, everyone comes to help. If there's a fire or a calamity, or you need to build something, not just a few, everybody, even the small children are considered, they can carry water, they can do whatever. And so this must have been going on in the back of his mind. He looked to his grandson and he said, ta-da, bring me the pine torches, or a pine torch. And ta-da, just went, he got it for him and he brought it to him. He took the torch and he lit it, and then he headed down out of the house and down to the terrace. Well, his grandson thought, what are you doing? He's kind of walking with him. And then all of a sudden, it's like he didn't have time to explain. He lit one of the drying rice bundles. This was his harvest. And Tada's like, what? And then he lit another, and then another, and another, and another. And now Tada, oh, Jesus, why? But he couldn't explain. He didn't have time to explain. It didn't take long before those, kind of at first the black smoke started to go up, and they burst into flames. And as the smoke grew and grew, and he set more of the bundles on fire. And by this point, the grandson he's distraught and upset. He's gone back to the house. He doesn't know what to do. His grandfather's gone mad. But luckily, an acolyte up in the Buddhist temple sees the smoke, knows it's not supposed to be there, looks even closer, sees the fire, and knows he must call the community. And so he goes to the bell, and sure enough, dong, 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 and he's able to ring it until even through the noise of the drums and the singing, the drums stop, the singing stops. They hear, they turn around, they look, and they see that the plateau is on fire. Well, no one hesitates. The young and the strong get running as fast as they can. The mothers begin scooping up their children. The grandmothers are grandfathers are trying to get there as fast as they can. Hamaguchi didn't have to wait long before the young, strong lads get there. They begin to put out the fire. He goes, no, leave it. Leave it? Why? Leave it. No. More arose. Now, by this time, Tada's come in from the house. He's gone mad. He's gone mad. He lit the rice on fire himself. And they're going, why? Why? And he said, he looked at the heads of households. Is everyone here? Is everyone here? Well, they began to count. And they began to look, and they could see that many of, even if they weren't quite there, they were on their way. Yes. And he said, fine, look. And he had them turn around. And by now the twilight had fallen, and he had them look out to the ocean. And what they saw was terrifying. For the horizon was like a big line, and it no longer was going away from them, but it was charging towards them. And it wasn't charging just towards them. All of a sudden, the rain came, the wind came, and as it came, it just came with such force that It was just deafening, and it came upon them and or at least down below, and many of them even jumped back even though it couldn't reach them, but then it went back and came and back and came and back 5 times the immensity of the sea had came upon them. And when all of the noise had stopped and now it was just rain, they stood speechless, for it was complete and total, utter destruction. Nothing was left. There wasn't a home. There wasn't the temple below was gone. I mean, just stood there. And then Hamaguchi said, "That's why I lit the rice on fire." It took a moment for them to recognize that he sacrificed his crop because he knew that they would come running. And though their homes were gone, not a soul was lost. And all of a sudden, ta-da, he bent to his father, "Please forgive me, forgive me." Many of them prostrated theirs. They recognized his selfless sacrifice. No. You are all here. We are all alive. All will be well. We'll find places to sleep in my house and the temple. We will rebuild. And they did. They did rebuild. It wasn't easy back then. They didn't have the communication like we did. It. No one knew they had suffered this tragedy for quite a while. But they slowly rebuilt. Being a wealthy man, he also put the bill for he paid to have a huge seawall built so that if a tsunami were to ever come again, that, well, it would not get them. And 100 years later, it did protect the community. But they never forgot. They never forgot him. And how do you repay someone for your life? Well, they did it by making him a daimyojin, which is kind of like a living god, for they said that he had the divine spirit within him, and they built him a shrine that stands there today. And many of the Japanese children will hear his story and learn of his selfless sacrifice, and helps us remember that when you love those, you are willing to sacrifice what needs to be done. And that's the story of Hamaguchi Goryo. All these inspiring stories. And I want you to think about this. Do you have the boldness? Do you have the bravery? Do you have the backbone? And I'm going to tell you, you do. These are people just like us, different time periods, different places, just like us. Another round of applause to Cassie Ashton. I don't usually do this, but You do when I tell.
yeah. Now, we are also, again, grateful to the Russell family to opening their home, for being a place for one of our house concerts, which again, this is the 78th, which means there will be a 79. Oh, you are amazing. Yes, there will be a 79. So right now, we're still working out details on it, but for sure, we're planning on the Friday of February 23rd. So still we'll have some things announced and figured out soon. And you just check us out at storycrossroads.org/house concerts. You'll find that out. But also, and for all of you, here, there, everywhere, there is our one stop, because we have at least 2 events every month. And so the best thing to do for those in person, definitely grab one of those bookmarks, put it on your refrigerator, you scan it or go to the link. You can see what's the latest, our email list and so forth. And for those who are here, hi, you can go to storycrossroads.org/1ONE-stop, S-T-O-P. So, right, you don't get a bookmark, sorry, but I mean, if you emailed me, I'm sure I could mail one to you, but still, you could just do the link. And we're also grateful to all of you. So again, this is something that people could enjoy whether or not they donate. But if you are ready to or want to add on what you've done, go to storycrossroads.org/donate. And for those on there, I put it in the link, but you can also see on the lower left that I have that address for you as well. So thank you. Until we tell again.